but we do have a quick conclusion wrapping up JavaScript. So some use cases we haven't talked about. People are starting to write server code in JavaScript using frameworks like Node.js. Now, here's my kind of big caveat about things like using Node. The whole issue about JavaScript being single-threaded means that when you're programming JavaScript in the browser, you have to have this asynchronous model where the calls cannot block. Right? You have to do the call, immediately return, and then wait for a callback and pick up where you left off. In an event-based model, that kind of makes sense because you do the call and you have no idea what's going to happen next or when it's going to happen. But when you're writing a web server, actually things happen in a fairly predictable order. Right? You get a request, you do some steps, you generate a reply, and life goes on. So an argument that has been made by Yehuda Katz, who's one of the core committers for Rails, like he says basically, look, if you don't know what's going to happen next, it's event-driven, you're not sure about the order of things, it's reasonable to use this event-driven model because it's kind of a match for how things are going to unfold. But if you're writing a server side where sort of an action happens and things happen in a particular order, it's a lot easier for the programmer to think about it in terms of this sequential model that's blocking, like the Rails model. Now, it is true that potentially if you write event-driven code correctly, you can get more memory-efficient use per user, much less memory per user. The question is whether most people have the cognitive skills to really do that and not make a lot of mistakes. It's hard to write event-driven code. On the client side, since client apps in JavaScript are getting more sophisticated, people have done multiple frameworks where the model view and controller are all expressed in JavaScript on the client. And then there's also a back-end server part, which you can write in any language you want. So Backbone is one of the more interesting examples of this recently. If you're doing mostly enhancement of a SaaS-centric application, probably things like Backbone are a little bit too heavyweight. And in these cases, the server just returns JSON objects, right? So this is, you're writing a pure JSON server. Everything you do on the client is based on handling data structures coming back from the server. Yahoo Mojito is an interesting framework where you can write the same content, and it could be rendered on the client or rendered on the server, depending on which one is more efficient. So they're trying to take advantage of the fact that if you're willing to write the server in JavaScript as well as the client, you can actually move work flexibly between the client and the server without rewriting, for example, how your views are rendered. And lastly, just to show a quick example of CoffeeScript, which is a source-to-source transformation framework for JavaScript. It's got great support in Rails, and I just wanted to show you what a little piece of it looks like, because one of the problems it solves is that it gets rid of a lot of the punctuation. So here's the CoffeeScript version of the same specs. Basically, the arrow is a shortcut for anonymous lambda of 0 arguments. Indentation rather than punctuation is used to indicate block scope. So again, and by the way, there's nothing that CoffeeScript does that you cannot do in plain JavaScript. It is just a source-to-source compiler. So the output of compiling CoffeeScript is JavaScript. It has no new abilities, but it gets rid of a lot of the noise. So I'm starting to gravitate towards using it. You can also declare instance variables, which are properly scoped in JavaScript. So I think CoffeeScript has a future. Rails basically supports it out of the box. If you put your files as .coffee rather than .js, it will automatically run the CoffeeScript compiler and generate JavaScript that is ready to serve in the production environment. So that is pretty cool. Yeah, I know, right? Right? Big pitfall to be aware of. Adding JavaScript will make my app more responsive. Often you're doing this and you end up widening the API to the server, doing expensive database calls. You could slow things down. Browsers have performance that's all over the place, so you don't actually know if this will be done. Testing is more complicated because now you have to handle more errors on the client side, whereas previously you could handle more of your errors on the server side. And that leads us to our last question, which is quick. Ben Bitdiddle is complaining that in his Ajax-intensive apps, some of the interactions feel sluggish. Which of these 4 is the likeliest cause?